Look, I love Bosworth, both in a historical context as one of the central points of the period that I study, the Wars of the Roses, of course, and the early Tudor period. But I also love Bosworth just for the area in which it inhabits. I've been coming to the Bosworth area for around 15 years, and I've built up many connections that mean a great deal to me. Historians that I once looked up to who have now become friends. Reenactors from whom I learned so much. Dedicated battlefield staff and heritage experts who give up their time to educate generations of people. I love Bosworth. And, you know, I really fondly call the area that I'm in right now, I call it battlefield country. Now, what you can see directly behind me is where it is now thought with good grounds that Richard III met his end. The field behind me is where Bosworth met its climax. And it's a really atmospheric place to visit. But when I talk about battlefield country, I don't just mean the literal battlefield. I mean the area around it, the towns and villages that all played a part in this story. I think of Dadlington. I think of Sutton, Cheney. I think of Ffenny Drayton. I think of Sheepy Magna. These are all areas in the locale that played a role in this story. Richard III arrived in this neck of the woods, coming from Leicester. Henry Tudor came out of Wales, and they met right here in the centre. Battlefield country, that is what Bosworth is all about. Now, of course, Bosworth did play a pivotal part in the reshaping of the political landscape in this country. But I think what is poignant is that 540 years later, we are still unravelling and telling the story to new audiences. Now, a new battlefield trail, Bosworth 1485, has been established right here in the heart of Leicestershire. And it aims to tell the narrative story of this battle through modern sculpture and artwork. It has been developed and beautifully modelled by some leading experts, and the battlefield trail is now active. In this video, I'm going to take you around some of the sites and just hopefully just give you a glimpse into this very picturesque scenic area, and perhaps you can see why I fell in love with Bosworth. Both the historical story and the landscape that we can still enjoy today. Now, Sutton Cheney has long been central to the narrative when it comes to the Battle of Bosworth. It's the nearest village located to the current battlefield visitor centre, and also the closest village to Ambion Hill. This is the hill that erroneously was thought for many centuries to be where the battle itself took place. Today, the village has strong associations with Richard III. The village church that stands here, it dates to the 14th century, and Richard's army would have passed by on the eve to battle. It has long been supposed that Richard actually heard his final mass in this church on the eve of battle. Now, that is a view that has been challenged academically over the years, but the connection still holds strong. The church plays host to a memorial service hosted by the Richard III Society every year. Inside, there are hundreds of Ricardian-themed kneelers for worshippers. And there's even a plaque which celebrates Richard's final moments. To the modern visitor, when they enter the church, they regularly are greeted by sights of Yorkish white rose wreaths. Sutton Cheney then is a fitting place for this new sculpture of Richard, kneeling, praying on his final day. It is a moment of reflection for Richard. It is a moment of great calmness that one often feels before moments of great magnitude and gravity. It is built of stone and it depicts Richard kneeling with his crown in his hand. You can see on the side, it says, "Loyalty me lie," Richard's famous motto, "Loyalty binds me." And we can see on the floor, people have left white rose wreaths for Richard. It is a very striking piece of art. I think it is poignant, I think it's evocative, and I think it's relatable. Even today, think of the calmness that modern boxers feel in the changing room just before they go out to fight. This is what is showing Richard. On the morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, the stage was set for a momentous clash, an encounter between two men who claimed that they were the King of England. Of course, on the throne for the previous 2 years had been the 32-year-old Richard III. Whatever the merits of Richard becoming king, the fact is he had alienated some members of his nobility. Those members of his nobility had defected to support the cause of a man who the French chronicler Philip de Commines regarded as a man without money, without right to the crown of England. And that was the 28-year-old Henry Tudor, who now was positioning himself as the rightful King of England. What is very interesting about the clash that took place right where I am currently standing is that it has often been characterised as a defining turning point in English history. And to many extents, it was. It represented the end of the Plantagenets and the dawn of Tudor England. But of course, on the morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, the thousands of men that gathered around me where I'm stood today, they would not have known that. They simply would have been preoccupied with surviving the day. Now, on that morning, Richard III had spent the previous night somewhere in that direction, which is Ambion Hill. He had completed the short journey, about a mile or so down the road. Henry Tudor's army had been based a couple of miles over there, probably on the grounds that belonged to Merivale Abbey. Now, when they woke on that morning, Henry completed his journey down Watling Street and up the road behind me, which is Fend Lanes. And so, the stage was set. And what a momentous encounter this was. Richard's army, he gave control of the vanguard to his loyal Duke, John Howard, John the Duke of Norfolk. Henry was not a military commander in the same guise that Richard was. Richard had military experience. He had been part of some victorious battles fought during the Wars of the Roses under the kingship of his brother Edward IV, and he'd also led an impressive campaign into Scotland when he had been the Duke of Gloucester. So Richard had military experience on his side. Henry did not. But what Henry did do was he delegated command of his army to people who knew what they were doing. And that included men like John Savage. It included Gilbert Talbot. It included the French commander Philibert de Cheney. And crucially, it included John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Now, in the fields around where I am stood, the two sides came in and they clashed, and gradually de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, was able to overcome the forces of the Duke of Norfolk. And this was disastrous for Richard, because Richard was watching and he was noticing that his side, the bulk of his forces, were losing the day. Now, ominously for both Richard and for Henry Tudor, on the periphery of this entire scene, watching with their 3,000 to 4,000 men, were the Stanleys. Now, up to this moment, both Henry and Richard had been trying to get the Stanleys to join their side. Richard had tried to use force and threats. Henry had tried to appeal using the bonds of kinship. The leader of the Stanley family, Thomas Stanley, was of course his stepfather. He was married to Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort. But despite all of Henry's pleas, to this moment, the Stanleys had still not joined Henry's army's side. They now stood on the sidelines watching. At some point during this clash, Richard spotted an opportunity. He noticed that Henry was exposed. He noticed that Henry was behind the bulk of his troops and only surrounded by a small bodyguard. What Richard decides to do is he decides to end the day quickly. He decides to launch a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. If he can kill this Welsh upstart who is claiming that he is the rightful King of England, then Richard can bring this nonsense to an end nice and early, nice and quickly. He can be back in Leicester for the afternoon. So Richard, he lowers his visor. He gathers a small troop of men behind him and he gives the signal. And he leads one of the most famous cavalry charges of the medieval period. Richard's horses, they thunder and they stomp as they come crashing down through the countryside. They've got Henry in their targets. Now, this would not have been over in a couple of seconds. This would have taken minutes for Richard to navigate through the terrain. It would have taken time for him to reach Henry. And during this time, Henry, of course, is looking up in the distance and he can see what's coming. He calls together his bodyguard. If we trust the chronicles or the word of one Frenchman who was there that day, who wrote a letter back to France the day after, if we trust his word, he says that Henry bravely dismounted his horse and stood with his troops, waiting for the clash and the crash of horses, metal and bones on each other. Now, Richard did reach Henry Tudor and he walloped into the Tudor bodyguard with great ferocity and force. We are told that Richard even was successful in unhorsing the giant, the absolute giant, John Cheney, who we believe stood around 6'9". Richard remarkably unhorsed this mammoth of a man before killing Henry Tudor's standard bearer, William Brandon. Now, how can I paint a picture here? What we've got to be clear about is that the standard bearer would have been riding thigh to thigh with Henry Tudor. Richard came within inches of killing Henry Tudor. I wonder, when Richard was going in for this attack, for this charge. Had he aimed for Henry Tudor and had just missed by a couple of inches and had taken out the standard bearer instead? William Brandon falls from his horse and he perishes in the soil. Now that flag collapses. And what that signals to many people watching the battle is that the commander is down, the day is done. Fortunately for Henry Tudor, he is still alive. He has almost looked Richard in the eye and he has survived this initial attack. The flag hits the floor, that proud Tudor banner that features the red dragon of Cadwallader, the green and white livery colours of the Tudor family. And a Welshman named Rhys Fawr ap Meredydd, Rhys the Mighty, he picks this flag back up and he begins waving it desperately. Up, still watching all of this take place, are the Stanleys. And when that flag comes back up, they decide now is the moment to intervene. Led that day by William Stanley, the brother of the leader of the Stanleys, Thomas, William marshals his men and the Stanleys come crashing down into the side of the Richard. Richard is suddenly surrounded and betrayed by the Stanleys. We are told by all of the Tudor sources that Richard fought manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. He did everything he could to bravely fight off the attack, but he was outnumbered, he was overwhelmed, and he was unhorsed. Now, somewhere around me, you can see these trees, and there would have been marshland here once upon a time. We don't know exactly where, but it is believed it is in this area behind me that Richard breathed his last. He was overwhelmed by his enemies and he was killed in a frenzied and ferocious and barbaric attack. He was the last king of England to die in battle. He was in many ways the last Plantagenet. This is the moment that everything changed. So how do we know that this was the site of horrific mass slaughter, where the deaths of thousands of men occurred in the fields behind me, and most famously and most well known, that this was the site of Richard III's last stand? Well, the reason we know that, and we can say with quite good certainty, is that between 2005 and 2009, there was an extensive archaeological survey conducted by the Battlefields Trust, using the expertise of people like Glenn Ford, Richard Mackinder, and Dr. Anne Curry. And what this archaeological survey discovered in many of the fields you can see behind me is the largest collection of cannon shot found on a medieval English battlefield. What this signified was that it is beyond doubt that around this area, which is fields on both sides of Fen Lane's farm, there most certainly was a battle that took place. A fearsome battle, a battle we can date with good accuracy to the 15th century. This is where the Battle of Bosworth, as it became known, was fought. Most pertinently, what was also found not far from the little grass verge behind me was a small silver gilt bow. Now, this was a badge that would have been gifted to somebody of high status. And we can, of course, famously know that the bow was the badge of Richard III. One of the working hypotheses is that this was gifted by the king to one of his men either that day or certainly in the run-up to Bosworth. We should also note, of course, that the bow was the badge of another principal commander who took part in the battle that day, and that was John de Vere. The fact that this silver bow has been found on this battlefield and that there has been such a spread of cannon shot is grounds, very good grounds, to believe that we are standing on the site of where the climax of the Battle of Bosworth took place. What more fitting place then is there on the periphery of the battlefield for this majestic and towering new sculpture known as the Storm Breaks? It is capable of being walked through. It changes with view from each approach. And what it represents is very much the chaos that unfurls on a battlefield when armies clash. There would have been a great cacophony of noise on these fields 540 years ago as Henry Tudor's army met Richard III's. There would have been cannon fire, there would have been the clashing of swords on armour, the breaking of bones, the anguished screams of dying men, and the beastly cries of the men inflicting that death upon their fellow human. I think it is, in many ways, a touching emblem of the tumult that happens when the world turns upside down in warfare. On each of the blocks, we can see representations of some of the men who were fighting that day. We see the white bow of Richard III. We see the arms of John de Vere, who for my money was very much man of the match during that battle. We have the Welsh dragon of Henry Tudor, and we have Richard's motto, loyalty me lie. I think this is a true testament to the chaos that is unleashed in war. Now, in the moments after the battle had ended, something needed to be done with many of the dead that littered the battlefield. What many people don't realise is that in the years to follow, the battle that we know today as the Battle of Bosworth was actually known as the Battle of Dadlington. Such was this village's proximity to where the fighting took place. Once the fighting had ceased, many of the war dead were brought here to St. James the Greater Church, where they were hastily buried in pits that are near my feet right now. Now, these were hastily dug graves, but this was at least consecrated ground. These are many men buried here who never got to go home to their families. This modern and beautiful, evocative artwork then, it's called The Healing, and it represents reconciliation between the two sides that day. We have one side in red and we have another side in white. In the middle, red and white rose petals, pointedly carved into heart symbols. they meet. This is the healing of Bosworth. Bosworth came and went. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to years, and years turned to centuries. Those who had been involved directly or indirectly with this clash of titans soon passed on. The fields where the battle had once raged simply returned to their original purpose, reworked by generations upon generations of farmers. The battlefield was lost. Fortunately, modern archaeology has allowed us to rediscover the lost battlefield, with archaeology uncovering many finds, including weaponry, cannon shot, and even that silver bow. This has allowed us to shift the battlefield from where it was once thought to have been, here on Ambion Hill, where the visitor centre exists today, a couple of miles away, to Fen Lanes. We have found the real battlefield, and that is due to modern archaeology. This sculpture you see behind me then, it celebrates this astonishing and exceptional archaeological achievement. What you see is a series of metal fragments coming together like a jigsaw to form one coin-like object. On one side, you can see the seal of King Richard III. On the other side, it shows Henry VII. Very much two sides of the same coin. And very much in keeping, I think, in ethos with the very commendable message that this battlefield centre tries to send out. Bosworth was the story of two kings and one remarkable day. And on that note, I think we should have a word for the excellent facilities provided on Ambion Hill by the Bosworth Battlefield Heritage Visitor Centre. The centre was opened in 1974, so it's been open now for 50 years. And though it can no longer claim to be the home of where the Bosworth battle took place, they still provide an excellent service in educating and illuminating visitors about the events that took place not too far from here. They have an award-winning exhibition. They have a medieval tithe barn that puts on food and drink to visitors like me. And they generally just provide a welcome atmosphere for people to learn history. Regularly, they put on living history events, for example. Behind me, you can see over there we have a war memorial, a registered war memorial that pays tribute to all of the dead, whatever side they fought on at Bosworth. It's a remarkable and poignant little area. And every year, an annual memorial service is held where people can gently lay a rose of red or white at the memorial. And right above my bald head, you can see two very large battle standards. These are the standards of Henry VII, the dragon, the Red Dragon of Wales, depicted fiercely on that green and white background. And then we also have the famous white bow of Richard III on the Yorkist colours of Murray and blue. They stand there proudly, waving in the wind every day, reminding people of the two leading commanders who once held sway at Bosworth. What a remarkable venue this is, and I do strongly recommend everyone visits if they're ever in the area. And so, I hope you enjoyed this trip through the local area. I hope you enjoyed the new Bosworth 1485 trail. This is history. This is Bosworth. I'll see you soon.